Hello and welcome. Okay, let's be real. Seeing any amount of blood when you're pregnant is, well, it's terrifying. It's so easy for your mind to jump to the absolute worst case scenario. In this explainer, we're going to calmly walk through what could be happening, from the really common stuff to the more critical signs, just to give you some clarity and a path forward. So, if this is you right now, listen. It is completely understandable to feel scared and to immediately start searching for answers. Your concern is 100% valid, and you've come to the right place to get some straight information. And here is the single most important thing I want you to hold on to right now. While you always have to take it seriously, bleeding during pregnancy does not automatically mean something is wrong. There are actually a lot of potential reasons, so let's break them down together, step by step. Here's our game plan. We're going to start with the most common and often totally harmless causes of bleeding early on. Then we'll get into the more urgent signs you need to watch for. After that, we'll cover what bleeding might mean later in pregnancy. And we'll wrap up with the single most important rule to follow through all of this. All right, let's dive in. The first trimester is by far when these bleeding concerns pop up most often. So let's start right there with some of the more common and, frankly, less alarming possibilities. So one of the earliest and most common things you might see is something called implantation bleeding. The best way to think about it is like planting a tiny seed. When that fertilized egg snuggles into the wall of your uterus to start growing, that little bit of disruption can cause a small amount of spotting. For a lot of women, this is just a completely normal sign of a new pregnancy. And this is where things can get confusing, right? Implantation bleeding usually happens just 6 to 12 days after fertilization, which means it can happen before you even have a positive pregnancy test. But here's the key difference. It's almost always way lighter than a normal period. We're talking light spotting, not a real flow. Another super common reason for a little spotting is just simple irritation. See, during pregnancy, your body sends a huge amount of extra blood flow down to the cervix, which makes it much more sensitive than usual. This means that things like sex or even a routine pelvic exam at the doctor's office can cause some very light bleeding. Again, this is typically nothing to worry about. Okay, so now that we've covered some of the more common, less scary causes, we do need to talk about the signs that are more concerning, the ones that mean you should get checked out right away. First up is something called a subchorionic hematoma. I know it sounds really complicated, but it's basically a pool of blood that collects between the wall of the uterus and the membrane that's surrounding the baby. You can almost think of it like a bruise, but on the inside of the womb. And this is a perfect example of why you just can't guess what's going on. Even if the bleeding from this is light, a subchorionic hematoma is something that absolutely needs to be monitored by a doctor to make sure the pregnancy is still on the right track. And now we have to talk about the fear that's probably on your mind, miscarriage. A miscarriage is the loss of a pregnancy, and while there can be many different signs, one of the most significant ones is heavier bleeding, something that's much more than just a little bit of spotting. Then there's something called an ectopic pregnancy. This is when the embryo implants somewhere it can't grow, most often in a fallopian tube. And let me be crystal clear here. This is extremely dangerous. It's a life-threatening medical emergency that needs immediate care, and it's often accompanied by severe pain. This quote from our source just says it all, doesn't it? The anxiety of sitting at home, falling down the rabbit hole of internet searches trying to diagnose yourself, that's often way worse than just going and getting a real answer. It is always, always better to be told it's nothing than to stay home wondering if it's something serious. Okay, let's shift gears now. Let's talk about bleeding that might happen later in pregnancy, during the second and third trimesters. The potential causes here are pretty different. First up is a condition called placenta previa. Our source gives a great analogy. Think of the cervix as the door to the womb. With placenta previa, the placenta is positioned really low in the uterus, and it ends up covering that door, either partially or completely. A huge telltale sign of this is often painless, bright red bleeding. Now, a much more urgent and serious condition is placenta abruption. This is a true emergency where the placenta actually starts to separate from the wall of the uterus. And unlike placenta previa, this is typically associated with a lot of pain and contractions. It's a very different picture. And of course, there is one cause of late-term bleeding that is actually a really good sign: the bloody show. This is that mix of mucus and blood that tells you your cervix is starting to prepare for labor. It means your baby is on the way. So we've covered a whole range of different causes, from things that are totally harmless to some that are very, very serious. And that brings us to our final and most critical point, the one rule that you absolutely have to follow. Okay, after hearing about everything from implantation spotting to placenta abruption, you might be wondering, what's the one thing I'm supposed to do? What's the takeaway? It's this. The most crucial point of this entire explainer is that you cannot and should not try to self-diagnose. It is nearly impossible for anyone who isn't a doctor or a midwife to know for sure what's causing the bleeding just by looking at it. So here is your clear, simple action plan. You need to go to the hospital or call your doctor immediately if you have any heavy bleeding, if you have severe pain with the bleeding, or even if the bleeding is bright red but totally painless. And number 4 is the most important. You go if you are ever in doubt. At the end of the day, it all boils down to one simple phrase. When in doubt, get checked out. Trust your gut. Trust your instincts. You are the #1 advocate for your health and for your baby's health. Please never, ever hesitate to get professional care. It really is the only path to getting peace of mind.